Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. In this episode, we focus on the Monroe Doctrine and its corollaries. Donald Trump, in his first term in office, went to the United Nations in 2018 and made a speech in which he said it has been the formal policy of our country since President Monroe that we reject the interference of foreign nations in this hemisphere and in our own affairs. That was in 2018 in his first term. Now we fast forward to the second term of Donald Trump, and just recently the Washington Post wrote an article with the headline, "Trump Revives Monroe Doctrine in U.S. Relations with Western Hemisphere." In that article by the Post, but for many in the region, that focus during Trump's first month in office has been a one-way street, reviving unpleasant memories of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, which declared the hemisphere a U.S. sphere of influence to the exclusion of other powers, and the manifest destiny that claimed a God-given right to American territorial expansion, causing concerns about expansion or imperialistic notions or paternalistic notions of the United States that have all become associated with the Monroe Doctrine. In this episode, we try to set the record straight because that was not what the Monroe Doctrine was all about. Yes, Monroe's original doctrine did seek exclusion of other powers from the Western Hemisphere, and yes, there was later this notion of manifest destiny, this divinely inspired right to expand the U.S. system of government, but it is misleading to link those two together, which happens seems like all the time. Let's try to clear this up by going back to the beginning. It's in the 1820s, early 1820s, Monroe's president of the United States, John Quincy Adams is Secretary of State. At the time, a number of republics were breaking away from the mother country of Spain. This is in South America, declaring themselves as independent republics. And the United States actually recognized a number of these new independent states, but there was also concern in the United States. Spain had become weak. They were no longer able to sort of sustain their colonial powers, but there was concern that other European nations might come in and take over that void and recolonize these South American states. And the United States was not in favor of that. Plus, there was concern about Russia. Russia was saber-rattling, making some noise in the northwest portion of North America, possibly some land grab there. And for Secretary of State Adams, enough was enough. He said it's time for the United States to take a stand, and he proposed to President Monroe that the United States should contest the right of Russia to any territorial establishment on this continent, and that we should assume distinctly the principle that the American continents are no longer subjects for any new European colonial establishments. Well, President Monroe agreed, and that December 2nd, 1823, in his annual message to Congress, under John Quincy Adams' pen, it was President Monroe that announced the following: "The occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." Monroe went a little bit further with a bit of a warning to those European powers that he declared that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. And again, talking not just about North America, but North, Central, and South America. The message that became known as the Monroe Doctrine was pretty straightforward. Europe, going forward, stay out of the Americas. No more colonies here. And by the way, part of the speech said, for the United States, we're not going to try to create any colonies in Europe either. This is a pretty bold declaration on behalf of the American president, still a relatively new nation, still not with a very powerful military to back up this very broad claim, but the Monroe Doctrine was largely respected by those European powers throughout the 19th century. Sure, there were a couple of incursions, Great Britain in Argentina, also with France taking over Mexico for a couple of years during the American Civil War, but these were relatively short term, and otherwise the Monroe Doctrine was actually a very successful foreign policy of the United States, again, throughout the 19th century. Now, during the 19th century, there was one addition to the Monroe Doctrine, and this came under the presidency of John Tyler. In fact, became known as the Tyler Doctrine. And it had to do with Hawaii, known at the time as the Sandwich Islands. Now, European powers were trying to perhaps annex the independent islands of Hawaii into their own sphere of influence, and the United States didn't like that idea. John Tyler didn't like that idea. The United States wasn't in a position to annex those islands themselves, but they certainly didn't want those European powers to come in and do so, and John Tyler made that known. Any such action could not but create dissatisfaction on the part of the United States at any attempt by another power, should such be threatened or feared to take possession of the islands, colonize them and subvert the native government. The idea was, let's expand the Monroe Doctrine, not only to include North, Central, and South America, but also this area of the Pacific to include the Hawaiian Islands. Now, one of the remarkable things about this, by the way, is that John Tyler, a Southern slaveholder who later supported secession by the American South, actually did a number of these negotiations with a black man from Hawaii, Timothy Haalilio, and also his colleague here, William Richards. They were the ones negotiating with President John Tyler. A bit of an odd state for a black man to be associated with that in the White House, but this is what eventually emerged as the Tyler Doctrine. Still, all of this was about keeping the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere, now to include parts of the Pacific. Also, again, the United States staying out of Europe, but nothing about this was about American expansion or imperialism. That was not part of anything to do with the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century. All right, many things changed at the turn of the century. Theodore Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. He has an expansive view of the presidency, and he has an expansive vision for the United States. And partly he was tired of some instability in the Western Hemisphere. For example, Germany was threatening military action to collect some debts from Venezuela, and that was causing all kinds of concern. 1904, there was an uprising in Santo Domingo, and actually Roosevelt decided to send American troops in to quell that uprising. And he said, you know what, it's time for an update to our American foreign policy. In his annual message, this is December 6th of 1904, he proclaimed a far more intrusive foreign policy than ever before in the United States. According to Theodore Roosevelt, chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Well, there was a lot of criticism of this, both domestically by Roosevelt's political rivals, but also from a number of those foreign powers in the Western Hemisphere. Thinking, well, who does he think he is? We're sovereign too. And the United States all of a sudden became this neighborhood bully ready to intrude on their own sovereign environment. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had no time for any of these concerns. He thought they were nonsense. What I wrote, he said, is the simplest common sense, and only the fool or the coward can treat it as aught else. What a queer set of evil-minded creatures, mixed with honest people of preposterous shortness of vision, our opponents are. He thought his policy was perfectly reasonable. It was good for everyone. Didn't seem to mind on his part that he might be invading the sovereignty of these other nations. Well, the new policy really had nothing to do with the Monroe Doctrine that had stood for 80 years. The policy of the Monroe Doctrine was, again, Europe stay out, but it wasn't about the Americans actually going into these other countries in any way, shape, or form. It has become known, though, as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps just because it had to do with the foreign policy of the United States when it came to the Western Hemisphere. But it really wasn't a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It was really its own doctrine in and of itself. It's kind of unfair to James Monroe to pull all this together under his name. Really should have been called the Roosevelt Doctrine all along, but as it turns out, it's been Monroe's name that has been dragged through the mud ever since. Angst in Latin America in particular over this more paternalistic approach, particularly after the doctrine then became associated with the anti-communist Cold War thinking during the middle of the 20th century. Including, for example, the covert U.S.-sponsored coup in Guatemala, in which President Eisenhower kind of disingenuously declared after that was over that the people of Guatemala, in a magnificent effort, have liberated themselves from the shackles of international communist direction. They have reclaimed the right of self-determination. Well, not exactly. It was pretty clearly, we found out later, that it was the Eisenhower administration that fomented that coup, and as these words got out, obviously created a lot of suspect relations and feelings in Latin America. You've also got, for example, a little bit further in the 1970s, the Cold War thinking persisting there, where the United States helped foster a coup in Chile, overthrowing the president, Salvador Allende. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger at the time was quoted as saying that the issues are much too important for Latin American voters to be left to decide for themselves. Again, this overly intrusive and paternalistic approach that kind of became consistent with that self-anointed, domineering role of the United States in the 20th century, but really consistent with the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, very little to do with the original doctrine that Monroe announced himself. Perhaps this is why President Barack Obama's Secretary of State John Kerry decided to announce a message to the Organization of American States. This is November of 2013. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. And after a pause, he said, that's worth applauding. That is not a bad thing. Again, pretty unfair to James Monroe. He's really repudiating that more intrusive policy that was the Roosevelt Corollary, not the original intent of the policy of James Monroe or Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Now, for the Trump administration, focusing a lot on keeping China out of the Western Hemisphere, that part of his policy is consistent with the Monroe Doctrine. But there's also this other parts of the Trump administration that are looking to be more interventionist in North America and in the Americas as a whole. That's a lot more to do with the policies of Theodore Roosevelt and very little to do with the policies of James Monroe. It's gotten all muddled over time under the flavor of the Monroe Doctrine, but we really should keep it separate. Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, really two very different approaches to foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. So that's some of the history for you of the Monroe Doctrine and its corollaries. For more on these stories, check out some of those links in the description for some of the other videos from Presidential Chronicles. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can check out my books on Amazon.com. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.